When I commented that the tool of the day had about run its course, a lot of people asked me to show what kind of welding equipment I have. So today we will take a look at my more modern welders. Welcome back to Black Bear Forge and the tool of the day. When I refer to a modern welder, I'm referring to a welding technique other than forge welding, where you use a hammer at the anvil. So that includes torch welding, stick welding, MIG welding, TIG welding, and probably a lot of other welding processes that I have absolutely no experience with. Of course, if you have been paying attention to previous videos, you know that for projects that are going out the door, I really prefer to weld with a torch. It is a lot slower, but I feel I can be a lot more precise, and I feel it complements the forge work better. So for customer projects, this is my preferred way to weld. I use a gas saver valve that shuts off the torch automatically if I'm doing other things. So when you hear that little pop in a video, that's this valve shutting the torch off. And I've done a whole video on my torch setup, some of the options I have for torches, and this valve, and I'll link to that right up in here. So you can go watch that if you want to see more about the torch setup. My next most likely method of welding is probably wire feed or MIG welding. And I do that over here at this big 4x8 table that is mostly a place where I stage projects that are in the process of being worked on, and it tends to collect a lot of junk. But I don't need much room on this table for doing the little bit of welding that I do. Most of what I do with the MIG welder are shop-related projects. They are tools, racks, stands, holders, things of that nature that welding is the most expedient way to do it, but it's not going out the door to a customer. I also have the ability to stick weld and TIG weld, although I rarely TIG weld, mostly because I have a scratch start or touch start or lift start, depending on how you refer to it, TIG welder, and it's sort of a pain, and since I don't use it all the time, I tend to stick the tungsten, and it's kind of a nuisance. So I'd rather torch weld instead of TIG weld most of the time. But if I were doing a lot of work that went out to customers that required welding, I would probably buy a TIG welder with a high frequency torch and an AC starter that would work much smoother, and I'd practice with it and I'd be better at it. But really, for the nature of the work I do and what I want to provide for my customers, I really don't need that. It's just something that I happen to have available because my welder just happens to do that. And this is that welder. This sits outside because it is an engine-driven welder generator. This is a Lincoln Ranger 250. It's the kind of welder you put in the back of a truck to take out to job sites for pipeline welding, construction welding, that kind of thing. But it has a lot of possibility and a lot of capabilities. This machine is mostly just a power source. It does not have the wire feeder for the MIG welder. It doesn't have gas valves, any of that kind of stuff. It just supplies raw power. And it has settings in it that will allow for MIG, TIG. It's really quite capable and will do a lot of different things. It's a much better welder than I am a welder. It is also a generator, and it does have enough power to run the new power hammer if I wanted to make a 40 amp 220 extension cord to run from the front of the shop where this welder is to the back of the shop where the new power hammer is. And I need a generator so rarely I don't really need to do that. But if I had a prolonged power outage and I just had to get some work done, this would provide lights, it would run grinders, it would run drill press, run the forge blower. It'd do pretty much whatever I had to do with it. The other day when I did a video while the power was out for a few hours, a lot of people responded that, oh, you need a generator. Well, I have a generator. It's just not always worth the trouble to stretch extension cords around the shop, especially when there's snow on the ground. You got to wallow through the wet snow to do it. It just isn't worth it for a couple hours worth of work. Now, if I was going to work all day, or if a power outage was going to last several days, you bet I would fire up the generator. It just depends on what you need to get done. Now, for the wire feeder, when I MIG weld, I have a Lincoln LN25 wire feeder. This plugs into the welding cable from the engine-driven welder and has hoses and gas valves for gas shielding the MIG weld, and this takes care of all that part to make that other welder turn into a MIG welder. Then on the cart where that wire feeder is, I also have a CO2 argon mix for MIG welding and some straight argon for TIG welding. But like I say, I don't TIG weld much. Then down here on the side of the cart is just where I have the TIG torch stored. Like I say, it's a scratch start TIG with a manual valve. I don't have anything automatic at all for that. So a lot of you are probably wondering, why do I have such obscure welding equipment when I'm in a fixed location? I have electrical power these days. Why an engine-driven welder? Well, the simple answer is I have electrical power these days. When I bought that welder, we were living in a house off-grid and we relied strictly on solar power, and we had a very limited solar array. We did not collect enough power really to run a blacksmith shop. So at that time, that's why I had the bull hammer, and it ran off an engine-driven air compressor. So I had to run a gas engine to run the air hammer. If I wanted to weld or run big machinery of any kind or work prolonged periods with machinery, I had to run that Lincoln welder as my generator. And that ran the 50-pound Little Giant that I had at the time. But the 25-pound Little Giant, the belt grinder, the drill press, and the very few lights that I used in the shop that I had at that time, all would run off of a single extension cord stretched from the house that was running off of solar power. So if your needs are small and you pay attention to your power, you could run a blacksmith shop on solar power. And that was another thing people suggested the other day when the power was out. They said, oh, you need some solar panels. And the truth is, I've got solar panels on this shop. They just aren't hooked up yet because this little office area over here is where the batteries and the controller will go, and it's not finished yet. So it's just another one of those long-term projects that one of these days I hope to have finished, but it won't be enough to run welding power. If you're going to weld on solar power, you need a significant number of panels just to put power into the battery bank, and then you need a big battery bank to support that kind of big draw at one time. But solar-powered blacksmithing is another whole topic of discussion, and I don't know if we'll get into that or not because right now the shop doesn't run on solar power. Now, my view on welding in the blacksmith shop is that welding and blacksmithing, and that's welding other than forge welding, are two different disciplines. You can be the best blacksmith in the world and know nothing about contemporary welding equipment. You don't need to know how to use a torch. You don't need to know how to use an arc welder, a MIG welder, a TIG welder, or any other welding technology. And you can be the best welder in the world and not know anything about blacksmithing. You wouldn't even have to know which end of the anvil you work on. But I do think it is worth having those two different disciplines working together at times. Modern welding equipment is a great way to make benches and stands and tool racks and spring tools, anvil tools. It really makes your life much more efficient if you have some of that modern welding equipment around. And a lot of blacksmiths do use that for assembling their projects. There's nothing wrong with that. It's simply the approach you choose to take, and it is not the approach I choose to take. So you'll see very little of that on this channel. I do it from time to time. There are some projects that I think using some more contemporary techniques and approaches does make the project possible. It means you can actually get it done. Like the butterfly the other day, trying to forge weld all that I think was somewhat unrealistic for what that project was. Doesn't mean it couldn't be done though. So if you're just getting started, my recommendation is to first learn to be a blacksmith before you learn to be a welder, unless you're already coming from the welding background, in which case you don't need any of this information. But then take a class at a local community college or work with a friend or a colleague that knows how to weld. I'm not going to teach you how to weld. I keep telling people I own a welder. I am not a welder. I don't offer welding as part of my business. If you bring me a trailer hitch, I'm going to send you somewhere else because I'm not going to work on it. But I do think it's a skill worth having, so it's worth learning. Just learn from somebody who is competent enough to teach you how to do it. And then go to your local welding supplier and see what they have for welders. The technology of welders today is vastly exceeds what that machine is. And if I were buying a welder today, I can pretty well guarantee you that's not what I would buy. Although I do like having the option of the generator, so yeah, maybe I would. Or I might have that and buy a small multi-process inverter style welder because they can do so much and they would take up less space in my shop. Anyways, you folks asked about my welders, so that's what I have for welders. I hope you enjoyed that. Give it a thumbs up if you did. Love it if you hit that subscribe button. Stick around, watch a few of the other videos, then make time in your day to get out to your shop, make something, but stay safe, wear your safety glasses, and we'll see you for the next one.